We'll wait another few seconds for people to arrive, but those of you who are here in the room and on Zoom, when you feel ready, settle into your meditation posture, being grateful that we've cultivated this practice coming home to the body, to the present moment. We've acquired a taste or developed the capacity to relax with the exposure of whatever it is that's moving and being felt. And you don't have to figure it out. It's really the way it is. It's like this now. What's moving feels like this. And what we're feeling also, of course, includes any habits of resistance and reactivity. This is the experience of nama rupa, as we say in the early Buddhist tradition, nama rupa mentality and materiality, or mind and body, the activity of the mind and body. And tonight in particular, as we continue our study of dependent origination, understanding how it is that this very seemingly very personal experience of stress and suffering, how that arises naturally as a natural process. So one thing we can sense directly, learn to sense directly, is just this quality of uneasiness or unsettledness, even if it's quite subtle at some point. Sometimes the activity of the mind and body seems very wild, very large, big, even overwhelming. Other times it might feel relatively settled and subtle. One way we can tune in is just to invite the possibility of letting things be, and just to notice how the patterns, the habits of the mind continue, even though we may intend to just let things be. Kind of usual language, we might say the doer is still inclined to do things, to think things, to figure out things, to label things, to make up meaning, to compare, to evaluate, to wonder. And it's often, most often, the habit of the mind to take all that cognitive activity personally, to impute a personal significance in a way that triggers another round of reactivity, another impulse to think or plan or compare or figure out. So using any meditative skill you have to settle, but to be curious about the underlying restlessness, especially of the mind, mental activity. You're not trying to get rid of it and you're not trying to figure it out. You're just sensing this more subtle restlessness of the mind and body without feeling compelled to evaluate it or judge it. Can it just be allowed? Even our judgments of our own meditation practice is part of restlessness. What's unsettled or unresolved, like the usually unseen, unacknowledged part in the heart that wants to be a good meditator or wants to do it right, and how that inevitably leads to this restlessness of the heart and mind. So as you have a sense of this subtle restlessness, then the natural question is how to relate skillfully. What is the skillful way to be present with? Skillful way to be understanding, not in a intellectual sense, but in terms of meeting or opening to the experience in a wise way, in a way that doesn't lead to stress. So we can learn directly, simply even through trial and error. But we shouldn't be surprised that the inner quality of our mind, heart, and body is a lot like the wider world. It's unsettled in the same way that traffic is unsettled and politics is unsettled and business is unsettled, unfixed. Even the activity of the birds and the trees is unsettled, dynamic, coming and going. Same with the quality, this conditioned quality of our heart, mind, and body, physicality and mentality, the activity of the body and the mind. It has its own restless nature, according to so many causes and conditions. Can this be okay the way it is, this unfinished or unresolved or restless nature that we're experiencing right here and now? What is the wise way to be relating? Do I need to run from it or hide from it? So we'll continue in silence for the rest of our sitting time, just doing the best we can and letting that be good enough. Again, we're just sitting here as best we can, relaxing. And then, of course, noticing all the reverberations, all the activity of the body and the mind, internal, external activities. And observing and feeling these activities with this wise acceptance. Of course, it's like this, feels like this. Of course, all this is moving now. In the same way we accept what's moving in our families and what's moving in our communities and what's moving in the wider world, we also learn to accept, to understand that right here with this sensitivity to the body and the mind, there will be this ceaseless activity, this movement. And perhaps we don't have to be at war with it or in conflict with it. We can normalize it, see it as a inherent natural process, this activity. It's reverberations from the past or reverberations from what's already been set in motion. And of course, there is this clear truth that it is like this now, it feels like this now. And just observing what is the wise way to be relating. And what are the stressful ways to be relating? What helps, what doesn't help? It's very pragmatic, this learning. And for the last 5 minutes or so, being especially interested in this dynamic place of contact, sense contact, the exposure through what we call the 6 sense gates. Mental activity being known, sounds being heard, sights being seen, sensations being felt, smells being smelt, and tastes being tasted. Which is just another way of talking about the totality of experience here and now. Sensitive in the ways we're sensitive. And this sensitivity that, in a sense, defines our existence is being touched by all of these activities coming and going. Just see if you can be interested at this place of contact. Including the contact of thought being known, emotion being felt. As if this were the very first time we were aware of sensitivity. So really opening to that experience of being sensitive to contact or sense experience as if for the first time. Is this exposure to sense contact a problem or not? Just see for yourself. So take a little time if you want to stand or stretch. Take care of your body. And Katie, we can turn the sconces on. I think it's the second one on the bottom left. No, I was wrong. That's the spotlight. You can turn that back on. Maybe it's the first one there. Yeah, that one. Yeah, and that can go all the way up. Great, thanks. Welcome back, everyone. Week 3 of our late spring Buddhist Studies course on dependent origination. As I mentioned, maybe week 1, this topic is considered one of the more subtle teachings of the Buddha, and it's thought, in the tradition, it's considered, after his awakening, his deep insight under the Bodhi tree, whether this is sort of mythology or reality, but it's a beautiful story anyway. Then the Buddha sat after that powerful night for 7 days, just experiencing the bliss of the heart's release. And I guess, I'm not sure the sequence, but I think toward the end of those 7 days, then he kind of clarified for himself, articulated for himself what he had directly experienced. Because, of course, dependent origination, as we're working with it, this is concept, right? Where it's a map, it's a conceptual map that either will be useful for us or not, depending on how we understand it and how we apply these words in a way that maybe will support seeing or understanding something about, the immediacy of our own mind experience. And it's said, though, at the end of those 7 days of resting in the bliss of awakening, the Buddha then reflected on dependent origination, clarified this. And as you probably remember me saying that week 1, this understanding of conditionality is really, it's kind of unique to the Buddha. I mean, there are a lot of wise people over the centuries in human civilization, of course. But in a way, this is that unique contribution, because the Buddha is articulating for us in a way that hopefully is useful, supportive of our own insight, how this very personal experience I have, you have, of suffering at times and being happy at other times, how all of that, happiness, unhappiness, is a natural process, an impersonal natural process. Because to us, with a mind conditioned by ignorance, as we say in Buddhism, but you don't have to feel bad about that, right? Because that, having a mind conditioned by ignorance, is also impersonal. It's not a personal failure on my part or your part, right? It's the way it is. Just like, some of our ash trees that get the ash disease, whatever it is, the emerald boil, anyway, can't remember what it is, some beetle attacking our many, many ash trees. And, but it's not personal. Or the solar flares that led to the Northern Lights. Nancy Bowler was telling me she was out leading a yoga retreat at the retreat center, and so all the retreatants out with Nancy got to see on Friday night, because I evidently was really big right at around 10 p.m. So people were up and they got to see the lights all over. Right, but that wasn't like some special blessing to those people or something like that. It was just causes and conditions. But we tend to personalize it. Even if life to us seems really boring, we personalize the boring experience. Like, it's boring for me, and that's not okay. Or I'm so happy it's boring because I don't want drama, or something like that. Because our mind is conditioned by ignorance, then we color everything. I don't know how many of you have opened up Lee Brasington's book, but it's one of the main study resources if you want. It's a good book. It's just recently finished a couple years ago. Lee is a Dharma teacher in our tradition in Zen meditation, but also a wonderful Dharma nerd, so he's written a couple books. And he's a student of Aya Khema. Some of you might know who Aya Khema is, a German woman who became a Buddhist nun, and was quite influential, although she didn't live that long once she became a teacher, Dharma teacher. I don't know how many years she taught, but probably not much more than 20, if that. And she taught a lot. One of the things she emphasized was concentration practice. So some of the people in the community have studied with Lee and done some jhana practice. But anyway, Lee has a really simple line. He says, like if he were going to summarize the teachings, the Buddhist teachings on dependent origination, he'd say, out of ignorance, the mind concocts the world. Right? Out of ignorance, the mind concocts the world. So even though, and we don't want to believe this, but we want to stay open to this. That this, each of our personal experiences that we're having right now is something the mind is concocting. And that word, sankhara, which is in that traditional formulation of dependent origination, where ignorance, sankhara, the mental formations, mental constructions, right? Because of ignorance, there are sankharas. This is that restlessness that we meditated on tonight. All these underlying tendencies. Sometimes, these are just poetic images, but sometimes I like that image of really taut strings, like you might find on a nice violin or cello or something like that. Just waiting to sympathetically vibrate with other stuff. And if one string starts to vibrate, the others start to sympathetically vibrate. Because we have these tendencies, these underlying tendencies that are being activated. And they're there because of the reverberations of the past. The past doesn't exist. It isn't back there somewhere. The past exists in each moment, each arising moment, as these tendencies. If you want to know the past, we get to know here and now. Because this here and now has been shaped by the past. Where else did here and now come from? Right? This experience. And I don't mean just my internal, psychological, emotional experience, but all of this, for each of us, is a lawful arising of all things past. It's like we talk about a moment of mind, and this moment of mind arising, conditioned by the previous moment of mind, before the previous moment ceases, it conditions the next arising. And on like that. And the reason why this is important is otherwise we're going to wrongly interpret the dependent origination teachings in a personal way. So I'm ignorant, so I've got these leftover reverberations, tendencies, and I have consciousness and a mind and body, and I'm sensitive, and I'm exposed to contact, and because of contact, there's feeling, tone, pleasantness and unpleasantness, and neutrality, and that triggers the tendency to desire, conditioned by ignorance, is craving. Like I crave the pleasant, and I crave to get rid of the unpleasant, and I even crave to ignore the neutral because it's neutral and I don't care about it. I only care about what's painful and pleasant because I want to get rid of the pain. I want to hold on to the pleasant, and I don't want to be distracted by the neutral. Right? And then that sets up this whole, we become the person who's obsessed with pleasure and pain, getting rid of pain, holding on to pleasure. And we live the life of someone who's obsessed with pleasure and pain, which is that whole mass of suffering. So that's the basic traditional formulation, and later centuries, there's a beautiful wheel, all kinds of ornateness got associated with it. And the Tibetan version of that wheel of life, it's all held. Some of you know this. I'll bring it out the last week. We have a beautiful painting in the office, the inner office, the teacher office. And but the whole wheel of dependent origination is in the jaws of a beast. Because if this is in fact, like if we open to it and our own experience confirms this, if this world is in fact concocted, in a way like a dream, and this is something that humans have been reflecting on for a long time, not just in the Buddhist tradition. What's that song we used to sing as kids? Merrily, 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 life is but a dream. Right? I mean, I don't know where that came from, but there's some sense, in the same way that dreams are so real, there's some sense that, and we have some direct experience where we really are caught up in some mind-created delusion, and somehow the situation pops the bubble. And we have that humiliating sometimes, but very powerful moment where we come out of a delusion and we're aware of coming out of a delusion. Or maybe we observe a good friend in that situation where they've been really in a bubble of their own construction, and then because of certain causes and conditions they were able to abandon that delusion, right? Because then we realize the vulnerability we live with, which is we can be confused by our constructions, profoundly confused and identified with our constructions. And we tend to kind of hide from when these things happen, like if we think our partner did something, because we misperceived some of the data, and then we got this ongoing myth in our mind, this story, and then our partner sets us straight. And it's so humiliating, so we tend to dismiss it, because it's hard to integrate that I could have been so wrong, because I was so sure, and now that turns out not to be true. And if we really relax with that, then it naturally is going to beg the question, well, what else is not true? What else is just constructed? So this is, we want to have that openness to that possibility. I just got a few quotes from the Buddhist tradition kind of making this point. So I mentioned Lee's wrote in that book on dependent origination, out of ignorance, the mind concocts the world. And it reminded me of a story, some of you, this popular story from the suttas, the Buddha's discourses, where, again, you don't have to believe this, but it's just nice, useful teaching stories at the very least. So a Dewa, a celestial being, so the Buddha spent, he did his meditation practice even after his deep insight, but he spent a lot of time teaching, during the days. And then at night, as the stories go, celestial beings would come down and want to be taught. And so he would. And so this night, a celestial being came down and said, I tried to find the end of it all, the end of the universe, the end of reality or whatever. And he had the name Skywalker, whatever the Pali equivalent of that is. And he said, but I couldn't find it. And he went on about how many eons he was trying to get to where it all ends, but couldn't find it. And then the Buddha had this response: it is not possible to reach by walking the end of the world. But I also tell you that unless you reach the end of the world, you will not reach the end of suffering. And then the celestial being had the wherewithal to ask, please explain this to me. So the Buddha said, in this very fathom-long body, and he probably means the body and mind, but he's kind of referring to here and now, this. In this very fathom-long body is the world, the origin of the world, the cessation of the world, and the way leading to the cessation of the world. It's right here. It's arising and ceasing right here. And this is the thing about the model or the map of dependent origination. It's really meant to be hopeful. It's meant to be inspiring. That there is clearly, no one has to convince us that there is suffering, there is dukkha, there is this. Even if we have a really good run and we're healthy, even then there's this underlying uneasiness, because whatever we got, whatever privilege we got or good run we have, assuming that that's the case, which it isn't always the case, of course, we know we can't hold on to it. We can't lock it away. So there's this element of what that we call dukkha. And the sense of dependent origination is that it arises dependent on the supporting conditions. And when those supporting conditions are not available, aren't present, then this whole mass of suffering, as it said in one of the suttas, ceases. So whatever it is we experience in an ongoing way, the burden of being me, the burden of having duties and responsibilities, the burden of having an aging body, the burden of living in a world where there's terrible injustice, the burden of not having not lived up to my aspirations or my values or hopes or whatever. All these different ways that our heart is appropriately, I guess, burdened. That all of that personal sense of being burdened, being tight, being afraid, being needy, all of that is being constructed moment after moment. And any moment, it doesn't have to be constructed. It doesn't matter, like we think, well, I've got so much momentum of delusion that, okay, I've been deluded for, at least this lifetime and maybe countless lifetimes before. So then the ignorant mind just assumes that there's going to be a long process of clarifying and liberating. But it's because we don't understand dependent origination. When there's this, there's that. With the arising of this, there will be the arising of that. Things that are mutually dependent, right? But when there's not this, there won't be that. Without the arising of this, there won't be the arising of that. So that's the map is really saying, like, whatever your personal experience of stress is, difficulty is, it's arising moment by moment, dependent on necessary supporting conditions. So what of those supporting conditions do we get to participate with? Because a lot is already in motion. Because what we might think is, well, if only I didn't have unpleasant experience. But we can't control that, right? Or if only I weren't conscious, if only I wasn't sensitive, so that leads us to, like, maybe wrongly thinking, well, I'll commit suicide. I'll get rid of this sensitivity. Well, in a Buddhist model of things, the momentum of the mind, the unfinished business of mind, just finds another body. No, I don't have proof, but, it's good to stay open to these things, that you don't get out of this by unplugging. And so, because that actually gets us interested. And especially when we open to the possibility we've been doing this a long time, doing the same thing, getting the same results, because then we might be willing to be a little bit more humble, and the quality of our investigation might be more useful. And then we have these maps. Let me read another couple others. This is from a well-known English Buddhist monk, Ajahn Jayasaro. He was a student of Ajahn Chah and has lived mostly in Thailand. His Win, my partner and Common Ground's co-founder, got to see his monastery in Thailand. It's evidently really beautiful. And he says, this person doesn't realize the truth. That he's talking about you and me. We don't realize the truth. Rather, it is through understanding what this person is that the truth is revealed. So we can free ourselves from the responsibility of realizing. We just need to get interested in this experience. And that activates the liberating process. As the Buddha said, it's the not understanding suffering that's the cause for suffering. Suffering is here and now, so it's not like theoretically what is suffering. It's our own experience of stress, of being burdened. Especially that more subtle kind of suffering. And then another quote from Milarepa. He's one of the more famous Tibetan Buddhist saints, maybe from the 1300s, somewhere around then. Really wonderful stories that you can read about. And he evidently said something like, I obtained all my knowledge observing the mind within. All my thoughts became the teachings of the Dhamma, and apparent phenomena are all the books we need, or all the books one needs. And so we're lucky, we have the teachings not to think about, but to support us in being intimate, being interested in the nature of our own mind. Now, I mentioned that, there's the traditional formulation, dependent on ignorance, sankhara arises. Sankhara, again, is that it's kind of a catch-all phrase, but in its essence, it's often untranslated too. When it is translated, though, it might be concoctions, mental constructions, mental formations, volitional formations. So it has different translations. So dependent on ignorance, sankhara arises. So when the mind misperceives, misunderstands, then there's going to be some unfinished business, something that is unsettled, alive. Dependent on this sankhara, consciousness comes to be. Dependent on consciousness, name and form, nama rupa. And nama rupa, mind and body, mentality, materiality. It's interesting, we don't really separate them. One teacher that I've been listening to, a Sri Lankan, very famous Sri Lankan monk, he gave like 33 lectures on Nibbana, and Shelley and Gabe and Wynn and I have been sort of slowly working our way through listening to these lectures many times. They've been nicely transcribed by Venerable Analio, this German monk, in English. So we've got our written form and we listen, and Venerable Analio is giving us commentaries on these talks by Venerable Jnanananda was his name, the Sri Lankan monk. And he talks about nama rupa, name and form, because remember, we're entertaining the possibility that this is concocted. So name and form, materiality, is really form in name only, as he says. Right? So it's sort of like, because the mind is constructing, because there's unfinished, something is unsettled, unfinished, reverberating, then consciousness is conditioned by that ignorance and that restlessness. And it concocts this mind that names things. I mean, nama, naming, it's really that mental phenomena of sort of like, what's going on here? Oh, there's that, Jeff's over there, and this looks like common ground, and I guess I'm here, and people out there on Zoom, and so and that whole process of naming, of perceiving, actually is what we bump up against. So when I bump up against the bench or the computer or sound, or all the other aspects of what we consider form or materiality, you can't really separate it from the sort of cognitive process of naming it or applying, projecting meaning on it. Does that make sense? So sometimes we wrongly think that we can have a pure experience of form, like hearing a sound. But we can't hear a sound without the mind that names things, that perceives things, coloring that experience. So is contact just that, can it be just pure? Or is it always going to be this sort of nama-rupa together? And it's the nama-rupa that is sensitive. And it's kind of sensitive to its own, this Sri Lankan monk again, Venerable Nyanananda, he really talks about it as a kind of resistance, or I think maybe Lee Brasington in his book calls it friction. So contact, because we're sensitive, we have contact, we're kind of bumping into the reverberations of our ignorance, of the mind's ignorance, or the mind not clearly perceiving, not clearly understanding. Which sort of makes sense just on that sort of theoretical level, that, we're spinning, just like in a dream, how the dream just weaves everything in. And, there could be some sound outside of the dream, but it just so naturally gets woven in. Or the dream triggers something, and then that becomes sort of feeds the unfolding of the dream. So we have a mind that has been suffering, but suffering in a way that the suffering seems personal, so that this experience of me is disturbed by that. That's a mind condition, not understanding, arrogantly convinced that there's somebody who's got a problem here. Somebody who wants something, somebody who has something that he doesn't want to lose, or whatever it might be. And then that's an unsettled place. So we have sankhara. And that sankhara leads to a consciousness that's colored by that ignorance, that sees things in terms of mind and body, exposure to sensitivity, contacts it likes, the pleasant ones, it doesn't like the unpleasant, reacting to the pleasantness and unpleasantness with craving, doing something about that craving, which is grasping. And then we become the one who grasped, the one who did something because of what we were experiencing. And that sets stuff in motion in our heart and around us. And we have to live with those reverberations. But there's a more simple version of that. That's sort of the 12 links. I ended with craving and becoming, but then it's the whole massive suffering, birth, aging, and death, which is just a simile for the whole massive suffering. Another moment of existence. It's not really meant so much to talk about another lifetime. It's really talking about moment by moment we're doing this. We're becoming the one in any moment of our life. We're becoming the one who was wrongly understanding that moment. There's a consequence for taking this moment of experience personally, then I become the person who took this moment of experience personally. There are consequences to thinking that, I'm the teacher. So if I have a little moment of conceit of I'm sitting up in the front of the room giving a talk about the nature of the mind, and then I become that person. And there are consequences to having identified or been attached with that perception. And the consequence is, whatever I constructed, then I have to protect it. But whatever we construct, it's always going to fall apart, because there's going to be another construction. So that's the uneasiness. It's like we can't really get anything. We always end up, we're always trying to get something solid, but we can't. So there's a restless quality to the whole movement in our hearts. But there's another sutta that I wanted to share before opening it up for discussion tonight. And I sent this along, I believe this week, in today's email to everybody. And it's a sutta from the Sutta Nipata collection, which is considered one of the older collections. When people have a set of teachings they want to protect, they always want to organize it their own way. And so there was a lot of sort of systemization of the Buddhist teachings. He taught for 45 years, and then, for 400 years almost, it was an oral tradition, and to keep it, to be able to memorize it, they sort of systematized it and organized it. But the Sutta Nipata collection is considered older because it was even mentioned in some of the other suttas at the time of the Buddha. And here he didn't use this sort of more formal 12-step. This is how he talked about dependent origination. And I'm going to use how Lee organized it just in a simple way, but you can read the actual sutta. It's kind of interesting. I recommend it. It's only a couple pages. So the Buddha's, this is one of the ways he taught. He would ask a question and then answer it. And so in this sutta, I forget if he asked this question or someone asked him this question, from where do quarrels and disputes arise? Which is a good question. So, we could look at our own world and all the aggression and injustice and meanness, and it's a very appropriate question, like from where does all this negativity, all this violence, where does it arise? What are the, using that conditionality formula, when there's this, there's that, with the arising of this, there's the arising of that. Without this, there's not that. Without the arising of this, there's not the arising of that. So in terms of all of that meanness that we see in our families and the wider world, what is the cause, or what are the supporting conditions for quarrels and disputes? And the Buddha answers, from what is endearing, there have arisen quarrels and disputes. Because things are dear to us, endearing to us, things we're attached to, there arises these quarrels and disputes, and all the pain and suffering goes on. It's like a long 3 or 4 sentences, the terribleness that comes from our disputes, like wars, for example, or, families that, siblings that are not speaking to each other, or, just the many ways that humans throw each other out of their hearts. And then, begs the question. And it makes sense too, it's like we're not going to make a big deal of things that to us are trivial or not important. But something that's important to me, that's endearing, that's dear to me, don't mess with it. So then the next question, of course, would be, where is the origin of finding things endearing? So when things are endearing, like what is the supporting condition? So when there's this, then I find things endearing. But when there's not this, I'm not finding things endearing. With the arising of what is the arising of me getting attached? Right? So what do you think the Buddha said in response to that? Things which are endearing in the world have desire as their origin. And here they mean desire, the Buddha means desire conditioned by ignorance. Because there is a pure form of desire, living beings have desire, but when we have this wrong understanding that this arising of desire is my desire, then we call it, like in Buddhism we make it a little clear, we call it craving, which is just desire plus ignorance, or desire, taking desire personally. And then we call that craving. So things are endearing because we want it, we crave it. We crave to get rid of what's unpleasant, and we crave to hold on what's pleasant. So liking, disliking. And so why do we find some things desirable? Why do we crave some things and not other things? What is the source of desire in the world? And the Buddha answers, desire arises in dependence upon what is called pleasant and unpleasant. So Win Fricky is going to teach for me next Monday, because Shelley and I are going to be teaching out on the West Coast at Cloud Mountain Meditation Retreat Center, leading a retreat. So Win is going to give a talk on Vedana, this feeling tone. And we'll have small groups next week where we'll be just sharing your own, taking this week to get interested in Vedana, in the feeling, the pleasantness, unpleasantness. So, that word in English, feeling, we use it a lot of different ways. So in this context, when we're translating the word Vedana, sometimes we'll use the words feeling tone just to make it different than our more generic word feeling. So we're talking about, with any experience, like even noticing a thought, or noticing a sound, or noticing sensation, there is a sense of its pleasantness, unpleasantness, or neutrality. And there isn't anything I can really do about it. Some of it's even instinctual. Like when we see something and it's pleasant. Like the example I use sometimes, a good friend of mine told me this like 50 years ago, but I found it fascinating because it's so true. Because we were in Yosemite doing backpacking in the backcountry in Yosemite, and some of you have been in the high Sierras, or maybe we were in Kings Canyon. I guess it was Kings Canyon, which is another national park a little south of Yosemite. And we were just kind of wondering, like, it's so beautiful, right? It's so pleasing to be there. And it was like, why? And he said, well, there's some research that, having spent so many eons as these sort of primates that were being hunted by predators, like lions, saber-toothed tigers, or whatever. We liked this where there were trees, not a really dense forest, but there were trees that we could climb, but we had good sight lines, so we could see, and so just instinctually we find it pleasant. And if you look at a lot of our parks with big trees but mowed lawns, we kind of like that. Even though most of us can't climb a tree, but theoretically, in our youth, we might have, and they trim the branches so you can't even get up to the trees. But anyway, yeah, it's just sort of interesting, like what arouses pleasantness and unpleasantness. And some of it, of course, is just more recently conditioned by culture, by our particular experience as a human being, this life, maybe previous lifetimes too, who knows. But we have this, so because of feeling tone conditioned by ignorance, right, then we have the arising of craving. And because of craving, we take things to be endearing, we get attached, and the traditional word we use here is grasping or clinging. We do something because of the craving. So it's one thing to really crave, and then to act on that craving kind of locks it in a deeper way. In a sense, we create karma, right? Because now we're doing something about our craving. We can feel attracted to somebody in the room, and then we can go stand next to them, right? Or say something to them. And that's different, because now we're acting on the craving. It's like, I'd really like to meet that person, But then we can do something about that craving. And then we're clinging, and we want to become the person who has that person, who, gets what they want, whatever that is, a relationship, Desire arises in independence upon what is called pleasant and unpleasant, Vedana, right? Where do pleasant and unpleasant have their origin, right? And like I mentioned briefly, this is automatic. It's like we don't get to say, like when you bring some food item in front of me, I'm going to look at that food item and I'm going to have a pleasant or unpleasant response or neutral response depending on my past conditioning, maybe even my instinctual conditioning. It's like I don't really eat meat, every once in a long while I'll have some. But, when I smell charred meat, somebody in the neighborhood having a barbecue, I salivate. I'm attracted to it, So it's pleasant, and then if I think about a lot of other things, then it doesn't really become unpleasant, but at least I have immunity to the pleasantness, so some of you know that experience. So what is the necessary supporting cause or condition for pleasantness and unpleasantness? It's really simple. Contact. Like being a sensitive human being, sensitive to sight and sound, smell and taste, touch, and also sensitive to our thoughts about whatever we're thinking about. Because we're sensing, there's going to be feeling tone. And why do we sense? And he answers that. Where does sense contact have its origin in the world? Sense contacts are dependent upon name and form, body and mind, materiality, mentality, right? So this is the sort of traditional early version of dependent origination. We have quarrels and disputes, our wild, hurting world, dependent on our heart finding things endearing, dependent on finding things desirable, craving, dependent on the different feeling tones, the different pleasantness and unpleasantness of sense contact, because we have a mind and body. When there are these supporting conditions, we have this very human, personal experience of stress. Now, a lot of those things we can't do something about, but one thing we can do, one place where we can apply some wisdom is how we look at pleasantness and unpleasantness. And that's what Wynn's going to talk about next week. I mean, we can go from ignorance to wisdom at any point in our experience. Like around sense contact, around how we relate to, we're in an argument, right? And some of you, maybe all of us, have had the experience where we're really invested in the quarrels and disputes and picking up, the Buddha goes on, even about picking up sticks and stones and doing something, physical in our disputes and quarrels. But I'm betting most of us have been in a heated argument or conflict, and all of a sudden, it's like our practice kicks in, and we have some wise space where we sense the absurdity, like this isn't helping me or you or anybody. This is not onward leading to anything but more stress. And because it's like we can be self-destructive or we can cause problems as long as the mind believes that it's going to lead somewhere. But as soon as we're clear that this is just making things worse, the mind will let it go, if we really understand that. And some people will argue with me when I say that, because they're like, I knew this was unhelpful, but I couldn't unhook from it. But probably what was really going on in your mind is, you had some clarity that this wasn't helpful, but you really still secretly hoped it was or would be, right? So it was because it's a tipping point. When that understanding dominates the mind, then the whole construction that hating this person makes sense or fighting this person makes sense. It all just falls apart. And we can talk about this now. I'm going to save the last 15 minutes just for discussion about this arising of me as a suffering being and the ceasing of me as a suffering being. Because it's really good to frame it for ourselves so that we don't impute a lot of substance to me as a suffering being. Because we can even do that with Buddhist ideas, like I described earlier in the talk. But to really open at least to the possibility that as entrenched as my suffering appears to be, I'm going to stay open to the possibility that this very entrenched sense of me being a suffering being has been, in this moment, constructed. And it didn't have to be constructed this way. There are other ways. But there's the momentum of habit. This is the mind does what it's conditioned to do. It relates, it misperceives, it constructs experience in the way that it's conditioned to do. Maybe I'll leave it here. See if there are some comments, both from folks online, questions about anything that we've studied so far, including some of the articles that I've sent out, comments from your own practice, especially this arising and ceasing of dukkha, right? And just your own experience of how the mind concocts reality and how that really frees us up. It really creates interest. Yeah. And for people in the room, in order for people online to hear you, you're going to need to sit up here if you would, and I'll hand you the mic so that people online can hear you. But I won't, because we're recording, I won't put the camera on you, just to protect your privacy if you want. Yeah, so thoughts, questions that come to mind. People online, you can just unmute yourself, and I'll amplify you for the whole group. Anybody? Yeah, please come up. Here, do you mind coming up so they can hear you?
My name is Bill. Anyway, you mentioned the origination of thought. And with the origination of thought, automatically another thought comes with that. And if that thought causes me dukkha, is there any way I can stop that second thought coming? And it sounds kind of, like saying the original thought, something touches my heart. For instance, I put my dog down a couple months ago or a while ago. And so the second thought comes, I miss him terribly, and I wish he was still back in my life, grief. So the question I got is there any way to just accept that second thought, or is there a Buddhist way of not getting, having that second thought of the suffer of the grief?
Yeah, that's exactly an interesting question. And the thing is, Bill, you can check out the answer, because what we're finding, it's like the whole experience of me feeling burdened by grief, the pain, the very real pain of loss, right? So that pain of loss is there, but our experience of relating to the pain of loss is conditioned by ignorance. This wrong understanding, to put it in sort of more blunt terms, we think the pain of loss is bad. And we feel the pain of, being around loved ones, including our lovely pets, is good. When everyone is harmonious and behaving themselves, that's good. But when they're not behaving or when they're gone, that's bad. But actually, it's just what it is. It's painful sometimes and pleasant sometimes. So what is that experience of grief without being confused by the pain of the grief, the unpleasantness of the grief? Because we have an arrogant certainty that the pain of the grief requires the next thought or the next action, whatever it might be. But maybe the pain of the grief, the pain of the loss, which is natural, is just that. It's that painful feeling. What is it to be aware of pain without being confused or imagining that pain is more than what it is? And this is something we can experiment. I mean, pain of loss, like a dear one, like a pet that we've had for a long time, that's a higher order practice, right? I mean, it takes a lot of wisdom. But now, because you have some time, and it's still, of course, going to happen, it's still going to arise, this is a good time. So when it arises, then be prepared to ask a question, is it okay to feel this? Is this pleasant or unpleasant? And you don't even need to ask yourself that, because you'll know, no, this is unpleasant. How do I know in this moment that it's unpleasant? Like this memory, some mental images, and then the emotional feeling that will instinctively know is unpleasant, right? Oh, it's unpleasant because it feels like this. This is the Vedana, right? This is the unpleasantness of that, whatever's going on in my heart. Okay, is it okay? Does somebody need to do something because it feels like this? And we're not saying that thinking is bad. You can think. But we're not thinking because I can't be with the unpleasantness. We're demonstrating to ourselves that I can be with pleasant feeling and just be with it. And I can be with unpleasant feeling and just be with it. And I can be with neutral feeling and just be with it. So then if I want to think about the dog, or if I want to get another dog, or if I want to pull out my old book of photographs and remember my times with my dog, you can do that, but I'm not going to do it because I don't know how to be with that feeling, the unpleasantness. Because I'm first going to check, can I be with that? It's the same thing like, a lot of us are moved by some of the things that are going on in the world. But, ideally, before we do activism, we'd make peace with what it feels like to live in a world that's like this. So that our action to make it a better world arises out of compassion for ourselves and everyone, not because we don't know how to be with the yucky feeling that we're living in a world that's like this. Does that make sense? Yeah, thanks, Bill, for bringing that up. It's really an important point. Let's see, somebody looks like they wrote something in... Hi, Sean. Sean wrote, "Hello, Mark. I would love to hear how right livelihood and our work world can be lightened up with the awareness of this cycle, functioning well with work colleagues, etc., with less self-identification." Yeah, and a lot of that, I just spoke of, Sean, but some of it is really about having a different view of the world. Like I said right at the beginning of tonight's talk, and I know this is really provocative, but I think it is useful to stay open to this, that from the dependent origination, the Buddhist teachings point of view, the world arises out of ignorance. You don't have this, this world that we experience, without ignorance. So it's messy. And getting along with other people is challenging. Always. Whether you've got a young adult that you're close to, or a partner that you've lived with, or just recently fallen in love and gotten in a partnership with someone, or just family of origin stuff, or being part of communities. It's hard. But we shouldn't be, and just like aging, having an aging body is hard. or having to figure out how to earn a living and how much is enough and how much is too much. Like if we have the good fortune to be able to have some excess, how much is excess? You know, how much is okay to have in the bank, or how many pair of pants is okay to have? You know, these sort of unanswerable questions. So there's nothing about our existence that is supportive of peace except two things: wisdom that understands that all of this doesn't refer back to me, and samadhi, which is a temporary, like when I, just to use a more commonplace example, when we take a walk in the woods, like on a beautiful spring day, like we had today, and we allow the mind to absorb in the walking and the smelling of the lilacs, and then it has temporary space from everything else because it's absorbed in a few things that are pleasant. And we can do that with meditation skill too, like just being with the breath, being with the experience of calm, being with the experience of stillness, the space of the mind, the stillness of the mind, into more refined states. And what we're doing is we're having a temporary vacation from being a sensitive being by absorbing in one specific subtle aspect of being a sensitive being, the mind that is retreated and is peaceful because it's retreated. And whether we do it by taking a walk in the woods or we do it by developing meditative skill, that's the samadhi, which is a good skill to have. But it's dependent on supporting conditions, samadhi. Well, wisdom, by its definition, is understanding the underlying nature in a way that we don't need to escape. And the Buddha calls this knowing the release. He said, by what we need to understand with all sense experiences, the very real experience of gratification, when we get what we want or get rid of what we don't want, the danger of being attached to getting what we want and getting rid of what we don't want. So the gratification, the danger, and the release. That's the hard one, the third one. Do we know the release so that I'm not dependent on gratification and I'm not thrown around by the danger of experience because I don't get attached? Do we know that experience of release? How to be a human being who's sensitive, knows the difference between pleasure and pain, knows what loss feels like, knows what beautiful experience feels like, but isn't confused by any of it. That's the aspiration of these teachings. And we just need to do the reflection. Like we have to get interested, like in the guided meditation tonight, and I'll leave it here. We have to get interested in our existential, all day long, but especially in our sitting practice. Can we be interested in our existential situation as a human being? That the heart's a little or a lot nervous. It's a little or a lot disturbed. It's a little or a lot uneasy. Because then if we're really interested in it, we'll see it in this conditional way. When there's this, there's that. With the arising of this, there's the arising of that. We'll see that the experience of me as a suffering being arises, but it also ceases. And in a sense, we start to connect the dots. We start to learn. Oh, when I'm not reacting to feeling tone, for example, there's a lot more space. When I'm hungry and attached and dependent on feeling tone, I really get pushed around. There's a sense of a me who really gets pushed around. Like when I have this idea that the Timberwolves have to win. I rarely watch sports, but I forget who I signed up for to be able to watch the game. And about, in the first few minutes, I don't know if anybody saw the game last night. The Timberwolves, for those of you out of town, is Minnesota's basketball team, and they haven't been in the playoffs in a long time. But anyway, they're doing pretty good. And they did pretty good for about the first 10 minutes of the game, and then it went south. And it was just like so painful. I had to shut it off. I got about 15 minutes of the game and it was like, I mean, I had a lot of clarity. It's like, this is not fun. You know, and then I realized, and I'm not kidding, it's like, I don't have to care. Like, it's like, I want them to win. It's really nice. It's sort of a nice thing, you know, just in our local community here to have a successful sports team. But it's okay if they're not. You know, Denver, those people in Denver can be happy. And I can be happy not to be dependent. Like, the sense of a me isn't going to rise and fall with how the basketball game goes. And it's just, it's so nice to be able to shut it off. Like, I don't have to know. And I feel that way about the news too. Like, we have to be able to walk away when we notice we're attached. We have to demonstrate to our heart, yeah, on one level it's important, but it's also important to realize my heart isn't in control. And that it's okay that things are going to be the way that they're going to be. And I'll do what I can, but there's a lot that I'm not going to control. And do I have to be unhappy? Does it help people who are really being harmed if I'm hurting? Does that contribute in any way? And it's really about understanding what compassion is. Like the example I always give, sorry, I'm just going to go one more minute. But like when we're with a dear one who's really hurting in the hospital, and we're really suffering because they're suffering, we're not helping them. They don't even want us around them, right? Because we go in and we got our own self-drama about how your suffering is really bothering me. You know, I need you to get better. This is not okay. And that's like another burden for them. It's like, oh my God, my illness is causing everyone to suffer. I hate it. You know, it's just this, the reverberations keep going. So thanks everyone. Hope to see you in 2 weeks. Win Fricke will be here next Sunday. Just a heads up that I'll be doing a day-long retreat on, I think it's the 25th of May, and a half-day retreat in the first, or maybe it's the second weekend in June, maybe June 8th. And Shelley is going to be leading a weekend retreat over Memorial Day weekend with Win Fricke, both on Zoom and at the retreat center. I think it's waiting list for the retreat center now, but still space for those of you on Zoom. And a number of other programs coming up as well. You could just check the weekly email or look at the calendar. Have a good couple weeks. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.